Captions. Hello, everyone. Oh, wow. Everyone's here, or a lot of people are here now. Welcome. As you're coming in, please let us know where you're tuning in from, what brought you here today, any of that, anything you want to tell us. What's your interest in the occult? I know I'm very interested in it. Hi, if this is your first time here, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum. Thanks so much for joining us for this virtual program for Modern Occultism, History, Theory, and Practice by Mitch Horowitz. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. I know that many of you are members, but if you're not, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. Please visit our website for more information or just contact me. Now on to our guests. Our author, Mitch Horowitz, is a historian of alternative spirituality. Yes. And one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. Mitch is a writer in residence at the New York Public Library and the PEN Award-winning author of books including Occult America, One Simple Idea, The Miracle Club, Daydream Believer, and Uncertain Places. Mitch's books have been translated into French, Arabic, Chinese, Italian, Spanish, Korean, and Portuguese, and his work is censored in China. Our moderator, Colin Dickey, is a writer, speaker, and academic, and has made a career out of collecting unusual objects and hidden histories all over the country. He's the author of multiple books, including Under the Eye of Power, How Fear of Secret Societies Shapes American Democracy, which we did a program for, Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places, and The Unidentified Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained. A regular contributor to the New Republic and Lapham's Quarterly, he is also the co-editor of the Morbid Anatomy anthology. With a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Southern California, he is an associate professor of creative writing at National University. Now, during the event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. Please be active and chat with us. And you can also ask questions at any time. You can post those into the Q&A section. Try not to post those in the chat because they might get lost. So the Q&A section is on the bottom left of the screen. And that is all from me for now. I will turn this over to Mitch and Colin. Enjoy.
Thank you, Omar.
Yeah, thanks so much, Omar. Yeah, so I think we'll go for a while, and if you guys have questions along the way, I'll try and catch them, but we'll also have some time at the end for questions more dedicatedly. Thank you again to Omar. Thank you to Mark Twain, and thank you for Mitch for writing this book. I loved this book. I had so much fun reading this. I think the number one thing I wanted to say is like the overwhelming just like generosity that I felt in this book, like towards not just your subject matter, but I think like the wide variety of possible readers. And that's the thing I think I wanted to start talking about maybe as a way in. I love that you have this quote. I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but and I don't even know how to say this guy's name. Wouter J. Hanegraaff.
You got it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Who has this line about studying religion and the occult, where and again I'm paraphrasing here, where you quote him directly. You can either be a gardener or a biologist. You can either be a practitioner or a student, and that you can't do both. And you also say right off that you disagree, that like and maybe you could start there, like the way that you approach these as both, as we could say, like sort of biologist and a gardener. I mean, maybe you could sort of talk about your kind of framing in your way in before we get any further, because I think that's helpful.
Absolutely. Walter Hanegraaff is a brilliant scholar of esotericism, and he's actually one of a handful of people in our generation who has legitimized the study of esotericism on an academic level. I owe a great debt to him, and so does anybody in the field. He's a true intellect, but he and I do see things differently on this count. Walter's attitude is, look, we are interested in biologists. We're not interested in gardeners. We don't want people who are practitioners. We want people who are hardcore scholars who are going to establish this field on the same foundation that every other academic discipline rests upon. My difference is in two areas. First of all, playing off of his metaphor, I suggest you can be a scientific agriculturalist where you're kind of doing both in a certain sense. But the simple fact is, when it comes to the historicity of belief, when it comes to the historicity of religion and spirituality, the simple fact really is that most of our modern books in this area, including great works of scholarship, seminal foundational works, are written by people who either come from or are adjacent to the congregations that they're writing about. For example, the flagship work on the life of Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science Church, is by a man named Robert Peel, who, he's now deceased, was a member of that congregation. Gershom Scholem, who really starting in the mid-20th century, reasserted the study of classical Kabbalah. Scholem is an observant, he's again now deceased, but Scholem was an observant Jew who I think, I don't know that he would have led with the fact that he was a believing Kabbalist, but he certainly took seriously some of the mystical principles in Kabbalah. And I felt it behooved me as the author to say, look, I do consider myself a believing historian. I want people to know where I'm coming from, especially since when you're writing about one of the traditional faiths, let's say the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, usually you're born into one of these things. But when you're writing about a spirituality that's sort of off to the margins, occult spirituality, meaning hidden, or esoteric spirituality, usually that's a selection, that's a choice that the individual has chosen to go down that particular rabbit hole. And I think it does demonstrate a certain respect for and trust in the reader to put one's cards on the table. There are some scholars who take great umbrage at that, who feel like, look, I don't have to declare my belief to anyone. And I respect that. I'm not trying to put anybody in a kind of a police lineup, but I do feel that one very frequently comes to these topics with a very decided point of view that directed a person's path to that particular unusual neck of the woods. So hence I make that declaration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, I think that is so fascinating as somebody who writes about adjacent topics. And I am constantly running up against a sense of people trying to sort of pigeonhole what I do as I'm either a believer or a skeptic. And I feel like so much of the work in this field, readers will come to it and will say, I need to know, does this person believe or not? Because that's going to determine basically how they evaluate the writing. And I feel like you really dispelled the binary here. You really sort of you've kind of rendered that question sort of moot in a way that I found really fun and refreshing and enlightening and sort of, as I said, sort of generous in this nice way. But I do think we should maybe at this point sort of back up. The book is Modern Occultism. Do you want to give, for people who haven't had a chance to look at it, a kind of overview of how you would define occultism for the purpose of this book, and specifically the idea of modern occultism and what you're
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. By the way, apropos of your point, it's very funny. I was smiling because somebody literally just asked me that question about you today. A friend of mine who's an editor at a Catholic university press said to me, hey, is this guy Colin, is he a believer or a skeptic? I said, well, I'm really not sure, but that's what I like about him. So that question does come up all the time. Modern occultism is my best reckoning of a work of what I hope is a work of sweeping history that traces occultism as a thought movement from its roots in late antiquity up through the present day. occultism being a term that comes from Latin occultus, meaning hidden or secret, which was a way that scholars, translators, clerics during the Renaissance referred to the spirituality of the pre-Christian world, Persia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, North Africa, things that they were rediscovering just in fragments, because we really only have fragments, during the Renaissance era. And they were struck with awe to realize that there was this vast spirituality that predated the Abrahamic religions literally by millennia, if you go back to ancient Egypt, and just populated the Western world, broadly defined, for centuries and centuries and centuries. And in late antiquity, as Rome adopted Christianity as its official state religion, and there was a battle of cultures, ideas, belief systems, and Christianity grew triumphant, and along at a later date came Islam. This aspect of Western culture that had animated the lives of millions of men and women was obfuscated, was forgotten, and was lost, except for threads and fragments. And that's really what occultism is. I consider it a kind of revivalist movement in a certain way. It's an effort to reconnect with, study, in some cases, adapt just these fragments that we have of religious systems that used to populate the Western world.
I mean, it's interesting. There's almost, occultism as a thing which is hidden. There's sort of two facets to that. There's both the nominal subject, this is a study of things that are not visible to the naked eye, but there's also, as you're describing, a history that has itself been sort of suppressed and erased and sort of broken and fragmented. So occults as a topic is also a sort of hidden thing unto itself. I mean, it's sort of like, you talk about fragments. This was really fascinating. One of the things you talked about was like, this is a quote from the book that I liked. When considering themes like alchemy, astrology, and hermeticism itself, it is important to realize that we do not have uninterrupted uniform connections. There's this sort of problem at the outset of like, how do you manage a history which is by nature broken, lost, forgotten, hidden, subject to a lot of embellishment, subject to a lot of fabulism, sort of invites a fictional frame, and yet you're trying to do something which is again very sort of grounded and historical and honest and truthful. And I'm fascinated how you sort of navigate that throughout this book.
It's so interesting because we in the 21st century, and this has been true for a long time, we operate under this prejudice that there's this source material that's available out there, and we call it Plato or Homer or Lao Tzu or the Bhagavad Gita or the Dhammapada, and we're just sure that we've got the sayings of Buddha, and we've got the sayings that were written down by the Chinese and Greek sages and so forth. And we actually really don't have this stuff. We have copies of copies of copies of copies that have been translated, sometimes across millennia. And as they've passed through the hands of different people, you've got people inserting things that just fit their point of view, inserting ideas that they like, removing ideas that they don't like, the things that human beings always engage in as they codify or canonize literature. And so, for example, I open the book with the age in which when the so-called Hermetic literature was being written down in Alexandria in the generations following the death of Cleopatra. And the Hermetic literature, which was ostensibly threads of Greek esoteric ideas that were, of Egyptian esoteric ideas that were committed to writing in Greek, this stuff came back to light during the Renaissance. It was rediscovered during the Renaissance. And yet, we don't even have the original copies. There was apparently, as the story is often told, and I recount it into the book, a Byzantine monk walked into the court in either 1460 or 1462. We really don't know. There are differing accounts of the Florentine leader, Cosimo de' Medici. And he had these Greek papyrus scrolls that contained what seemed to be this primeval theology that went back to ancient Egypt. We don't even have those originals. We don't have those originals. They're not sitting in a museum or an archive anywhere. We have copies of copies of copies. And when this stuff reached Westerners during the Renaissance. It was threadbare then. I'm going to have the stuff that they were translating from, as it happened then, Greek to Latin. So we're so impoverished with respect to our ancient past, and I tried to be mindful of that throughout the book, especially in the manner that we are accustomed to referring to authors or figures, many of whom, including Socrates and Plato for that matter, we don't even know they existed. And the problem is all the thicker when we're dealing with some of this literature that was suppressed for so many years. And we really are on our knees peering through a keyhole. We have the merest, slenderest threads of this material, and that has to be remembered. So I'm always trying to remind people that although the study of occultism, the study of esotericism is very much a kind of revivalist study, it's an act of reconstruction, that which we're reconstructing, very threadbare, very threadbare.
But it seems like also that's part of the allure, right? Like I'm thinking about, the movie Memento and the idea that like the case file that has been redacted becomes such an important part for Leonard Shelby's sort of like endless search for the killer. And I think like there's something about this lost, fragmented archive that is, plays into it. Then because then that there's something incomplete. There's something out there worth searching for. There's something that is sort of fascinating. It seems like that itself also drives people to this study, or it sort of adds a sort of sheen or a shine to the study, this idea that there's always something that is broken, that is lost, that you're sort of either rediscovering yourself, or at least have the possibility of rediscovering, or you are deliberately sort of creatively sort of covering up the cracks with your own additions and emendations, right?
Absolutely. There's always the wish. It was funny, during the Renaissance, one of the concepts that really animated the Renaissance mind was this search for a prisca theologia, primeval theology, something that predated everything else. And in a way, we as a human community have never lost our hunger for that. We tend to equate vintage with legitimacy. And when our wish to find those lost papyrus leaves, so to speak, is unsatisfied, as it very often is, we use drama to fill in the cracks. And sometimes this drama can be very brilliant, and sometimes this drama can be very alluring. Sometimes this drama creates entire religions, like Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon, for example, which is a fascinating melange of Gnosticism, elements of ancient history, elements of central New York folklore. It's extraordinary, but it's important for us to understand that there is an element of theatricality behind all our religions and faiths, including the mainstream ones. Even the Jewish liturgy, which people sometimes think is ancient, it goes back to the medieval era, and it's very old and it's very beautiful, but it is post-antique, and it's important to remember that. All the more so when you've got a mid-19th century figure, for example, like the French occultist Eliphas Levi, who is devising all these correspondences between modern tarot and Kabbalah. And Gershom Scholem, the Kabbalistic scholar, called them brilliant misunderstandings, which I thought was a good way of putting it, because Levi's work drawing these really complex correspondences between tarot and Kabbalah, it's ahistorical. There's no correspondence whatsoever between Kabbalah and tarot. And at the time Kabbalah was being devised, tarot didn't really even exist yet, but when it did come into existence, it was essentially, I'm going to use a word that people don't always like, it was a game. But it's also important to remember that when I say game, that doesn't mean I'm minimizing it any more than to call a drama a play is minimizing it, or to say a musician is playing something is minimizing it. A game had a very richer conception in the Middle Ages and medieval era, just like we might use the term carnival and we think of kids and cotton candy. Well, a carnival or a passion play had much deeper conceptions in the medieval era. But that being the case, there's no correspondence between Kabbalah historically and tarot, none. And yet the system that Levi created, it's so rich and it's so complex, you could fall into it. And I'm not objecting to that. because something is novel doesn't mean it's trivial, and because something is old doesn't mean that it's true. I just want practitioners to, I don't want us to have amnesia. I just want us to understand our own history. Gershom Scholem had a reason when he referred to Levi's brilliant misunderstandings, and he wasn't blanketly critical of Levi, but it's important just to understand that this was the creation of a brilliant man, and it was a modern creation, which doesn't mean that the individual can't find value in it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe, I mean, because you do a great job of the prehistory from antiquity, but the book is modern occultism, and I think maybe we should talk a little bit about because you brought up Eliphas Levi, who you cite as kind of the turning point, the figure who sort of ushers in an era of modern occultism. So maybe you could give us a kind of broad definition of what makes modern occultism modern, and then maybe talk more about Eliphas Levi and and how he sort of figures as that person who ushers in this age of whatever modern occultism is.
Absolutely. I have to confess in all frankness that my title is a bit of an oxymoron, because occultism is a modern movement by its very nature. Occultism is a modern word. My definition of modernity is everything that's post-ancient. So once we really start to get beyond the final vestiges of the classical pagan world, we're in modernity as I render it in the book. So all of occultism is really a modern movement that seeks to reach backwards. And Levi was an extraordinary figure. He was born Louis Alphonse Constant, and he was a Christian Kabbalist. He was an occultist and a Christian who had a passion for Kabbalah. So he thought, hey, wouldn't it be neat if I created a phoneticized Hebrew variant of my name, which became Eliphas Levi Zachad. And Levi was a very interesting figure, because not only did he really create the occult revival from very bare threads starting in the mid-19th century. This was almost a generation before Madame H.P. Blavatsky came along. She really completed the circle. But Levi, working by himself, devised he wrote two books that became incorporated into a single volume, Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. And that's really the ore text. That's the source book where the entire Western occult revival began. And I admire the man because he lived in a more brutal era. And we love to sit around in our pajamas, blathering on social media and ordering Chipotle and so forth. And this was a man who he attended seminary. It didn't work out for him. He was too much of a libertine. He was sort of a sex, drugs, and rock and roll guy and couldn't stick around in seminary for very long. And when he left seminary, he began to write political tracts. And this was in the 1840s, and he was what we today would probably call a Christian socialist. And this did not sit well with the monarchical government that was in existence at that time in France. And he was thrown in prison for 11 months along with his publisher. They were fined. They were thrown in prison. Horrible, unhealthy, dangerous conditions in Parisian prisons. This was a man who really had skin in the game. And he came out and he was saying to himself, I'm looking for a way to place power in the hands of the individual. Okay, so Christianity, Catholicism, not exactly for me. Socialism, yes, but that's already gotten me thrown in jail. So he began to question whether these antique philosophies held something that could re-empower the individual. That was his impulse. It was a kind of populist impulse. It's a funny word to use because the book is very densely written, and it's not an easy book, Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. It's a very alluring book. It's a very exciting book. But he thought this is the turnkey, perhaps, that can place power in the hands of the individual. And he never looked back, and that was his life.
I mean, it's fascinating. There's sort of two, in my mind, kind of two parallel trajectories here. There's one, and this is my kind of broad strokes kind of history of Western thought, where you have a period in which, God is the measure of all things, that anything, that humans' existence is, determined by God, and you sort of exist to please God, and whatever bad things happen, that's because God wants, that's the causal mechanism for everything. And then you shift to a modern era, the Erasmus line, man is the measure of all things, this sort of reorientation towards the individual, the human, as the sort of sovereign identity that sort of determines the world. And sort of parallel that, you have an earlier version of occultism and magic, which again, sort of reductively, one of the things it seems to be about is that there is all of this sort of power sort of moving through the world. It's coming down from the stars, it's in stones, it's and the magi is the person who is able to understand where these sort of power networks are going and then control them and manipulate them. So you're an astrologer, you're reading goat entrails, you're doing whatever, but you are able to sort of make use of that sort of free-flowing power that's everywhere. But it sounds like what happens with Levi and what you're talking about is sort of how do you empower the individual. It's sort of a kind of reframing of the power of occult magic, less around sort of understanding the world as the sort of causal mechanism, but more sort of like, what can I do as an individual to control these things and sort of empower the individual in the way that you're talking about. Sort of an interesting kind of reframing of what the sort of central focus of the occult is, from like the world to the self almost. I don't know, is that?
Yeah, I think that's true. You'll find that within the work of the early occultists, Eliphas Levi, P.B. Randolph, who was a Black man here in the United States, not too far distant from Eliphas Levi in terms of vintage, and then later Madame Blavatsky. There maybe less so Madame Blavatsky, but certainly Levi and P.B. Randolph. They're very much still within an Abrahamic framework, as you were describing it. If basically we live in a cause and effect world, and if you're good, you're going to get rain during a harvest season, and if you're bad, the locusts are going to come. And the funny thing is that framework, which informs Judaism, Christianity, Islam, these religions are not wildly different. They were all born in the same place. The difference between Jewish civil law, the pillars of Islam, and the Beatitudes is a whisker thin. And it's the irony of the Western world. I mean, these three religions are actually not altogether different, and they all come from about 100 square miles. And we see how that's continued to play out. And you have this Abrahamic framework, which very heavily informs the work of these guys. So they think in terms of what's good, what's bad, what's up, what's down, what's black, what's white. And to some extent, that tempers, but also limits their intellectual expansiveness. They are interested in investing power in the individual, but they're very, very locked within this Judeo-Christian framework that they know from their background. And actually, I think that's continued into the 21st century. I think it's difficult for people in the Western world to engage in thought experiments that go outside those parameters. And what lay outside those parameters can be vast and can be extraordinary in ways that I can't possibly draw perimeters around, but I do see those parameters of a kind of almost frankly a sin and salvation religion informing us over and over again. It wasn't quite that way in ancient Egypt. It wasn't quite that way in ancient Rome. And admittedly, it was a more brutal way of life, but it was a different way of life. And there wasn't necessarily this thought process that everything converges into this one monotheistic creator. It wasn't precisely that way. It was a universe, especially in ancient Egypt, for example, of competing laws and forces, very complex laws and forces, and tragic endings as equal as happy endings, both among the gods and among us here on this plane of reality. And I see that by dint of familiarity, the Abrahamic point of view, even within some of these supposedly radical occult figures, it reasserts itself. And I see that almost everywhere today. And I always issue a yellow light about that, because that can be very limiting when you're engaging in thought experiments.
I mean, yeah. And, thinking about sort of what else can be out there besides the Abrahamic religions, of course, I mean, brings up another thing that's a thread that runs through a lot of this, is that so many of the figures that you talk about are, for for lack of, they're non-cis men, so this is a history in which women and other sort of non-men sort of figure prominently, whether or not, and maybe you can talk about some of these folks, although some of them may be familiar. We've touched on, but the public universal friend, who is a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
The Fox sisters. Josh has asked us to talk about spiritualism, and the spiritualism was a movement that was heavily populated by women in roles of leadership and sort of guidance and that kind of thing. Mary Baker Eddy, who's already come up, Madame Blavatsky. So you have this whole sort of history of sort of powerful spiritual leaders who are not cis men, and that becomes a kind of shadow spiritual history of the United States that is sort of pretty quickly treated as sort of sort of, it's derided, it's treated as sort of fringe and superstitious, but I think no more kooky than what passes for a lot of mainstream religion. So I think so anyways, but maybe you could talk about some of these figures, these women and other non-binary folks who really inform your book here, because I think they're all fascinating.
Absolutely. One of the things that I was so surprised to discover when I was working on my first book, Occult America, and then later it reasserted itself as I was working on this one, is that there is, and I really think it could be stated in dramatic terms, there is this whole counter shadow history. There's this underground history of either non-binary sexuality or female empowerment that grows like a DNA strand with occult and esoteric spirituality. Because, let's say in the American colonies and then later in the United States, look, this was a rural place. You had church, you had farm, you had family, you maybe had a Grange Hall, maybe a public house or something like that. And that was about it. There were very few hospitals. There were very few universities. There weren't lecture societies just popping up out of the cornfields. And if somebody wanted some sort of a voice in the culture and they were locked out of politics, which obviously women were, they could go into religion, but only of a certain sort. You have Mother Ann Lee, for example, the founder of the Shakers, who sojourned from Manchester to Albany, New York, started the first Shaker colony, and those villages extended as far north as Maine, as far south as Kentucky. Jemima Wilkinson, the public universal friend, young woman, 1775, she contracts typhus fever, goes to bed. Her family is sure she's a goner. She springs up out of bed one day, identifies herself as the public universal friend, a male identifying spirit in a feminine body, and the townspeople in Rhode Island, Cumberland, Rhode Island, are shocked because none of them have ever seen a woman speaking in public before, much less a female religious leader. And she winds up traveling around, crossing between British and US battle lines during the Revolutionary War. It's just mind-blowing to people. It's simply mind-blowing. And then this continues apace. And into the 19th century, when the movement called spiritualism, or talking to the dead, gained popularity, it was through two teenage girls, Kate and Margaret Fox, living in a little log cabin outside of Rochester, New York. Everyday folk, working folk. And I think that's part of why these movements caught on so quickly, because people were not only enraptured with the idea that maybe the age of prophecy didn't just belong to biblical antiquity, but suddenly, here are these migrants from England who, in the form of Anne Lee, who assumed the role of prophet. Here's Kate and Margaret Fox, two adolescent girls in a log cabin in central New York State. Jemima Wilkinson, a Quaker girl from a farm in Cumberland, Rhode Island, and lots of other people besides. And most spirit mediums throughout a good deal of the 19th century were in fact women, and they were seen as the presiding presence, the medium at the seance table. And spiritualism quickly did form its own societies, clubs, newspapers, newsletters. And so if you're a woman who wants a voice within the civic and religious culture, spiritualism is open to you. And that story is only just getting told in our generation, is only just getting understood in our generation. It's new. We haven't really understood it. Occult spirituality cracked open that door in a very significant way.
I mean, yeah, it was so fascinating to follow some of these threads, because obviously I knew a lot of these figures, and I've written about some of them, but then you would still do these really amazing things where I was just not prepared to follow a line of thought. So Andrew Jackson Davis is sort of one of the few major spiritualist figures who was not a woman, who was a man.
Yeah.
But you trace, let's see if I from Andrew Jackson Davis, who is a sort of mid-19th century figure, you go to Phineas Quimby, to Mary Baker Eddy, to Marcus Garvey, and on to Charles Wilson Peele, Power of Positive Thinking. I was just sort of like, this is a really fascinating sort of lineage and connection. And for several years, I lived in Pawling, New York, upstate, part of the burned over district, and the home of Charles Wilson Peele. The town motto being "where positive thinking was born," or some garbage thing like that. I don't know. It was pretty dreary.
That was Pawling, right? Pawling,
yeah,
New York.
New York. Yeah. But I loved sort of seeing the way, because again, I think the standard history of America is often one in which there are sort of acceptable mainstream historical topics, presidents, wars, civic leaders, and then there's this fringe garbage. The spiritualists, the Christian Scientists, all this other stuff, and in fact, of course, as you and I both know, that separation is entirely imposed and is entirely fictitious. That these two things, in fact, bleed all over each other and in really fascinating ways. So that we could go from a spiritualist to Marcus Garvey to a best-selling self-help book, that is still sort of entered into the lexicon in these sort of, ordinary and banal kind of ways. So we're coming up to the Q&A section. So I wanted to move a little bit more into the second half of the 20th century, because I feel like that is an important part of the book. And in fact, you begin this book at the very opening with Jack Parsons. It's not only a legendary figure, but again, who exists at the center, the nexus of so many random and disparate threads of American post-war culture and American pre-war culture that all come together, or at least pass through Jack Parsons. And so maybe you could talk about both who he is, and then also why you open the book with him, and why he becomes such an important part of the final few chapters.
Parsons is somebody who seems to attract such general interest, and it's strange because it's not. I would say even 15 years ago, he was an obscure figure, and suddenly he has kind of emerged as this pre-counterculture icon, and everybody seems interested in Jack Parsons. In fact, his Wikipedia page is practically longer than Winston Churchill's. It's sort of funny in our 21st century who we get interested in. Parsons, for those who don't know, was a rocket scientist, rocket engineer, who was one of the co-founders of the Jet Propulsion Labs in Pasadena, which mythically bears his initials, JPL, Jack Parsons Lives, some say. And he was also an occultist, and he was a protege to Aleister Crowley, who was still living elderly and decamped outside London at the time. Parsons was a bohemian. He founded a group home in Pasadena called the Parsonage. After the Second World War, this attracted a lot of people who were practicing Thelema, or the magical system, ethical system that Aleister Crowley had pioneered in modernity. And he attracted a recently demobilized naval captain named L. Ron Hubbard. And of course, we all know what he went on to do. And the two of them got along for a period of time, and then they didn't get along after Parsons found that Hubbard not only made off with his girlfriend, but made off with a great deal of his money too. Tough lesson for Jack, which caused a split between him and Aleister Crowley. Crowley was a tough, sometimes cruel taskmaster, and he thought Jack was a fool. How could he have gotten snookered by this guy? I'm supposed to teach you people to do magic and to be more clever than that. And yet it was very interesting because Jack resented Crowley turning his back on him. And yet in his resentment, he came to feel that maybe there was a problem with Crowley's system, stemming not only from the fact that Crowley himself harbored a certain personal cruelty, which he did, but he felt that magic needed to be simpler, that Crowley was recreating this very dense liturgy and ceremony and ritual. And Jack, towards the end of his life and his writings, asked himself the question of whether all this was necessary, which is a question that I'm asking today in the 21st century. This is a more a different tenor than a historical question. It's a practitioner's question. It's a philosophical question. But is all this thickly rendered liturgy necessary? Is it necessary in religion? Is it necessary in occultism? What is it for? What does it accomplish? What does it achieve? And Jack was asking those questions in the late 1940s, and I was very touched by that. I was very touched by the manner in which he was emotionally hurt by being pushed out and rejected by Crowley, but rather than just crumbling up into a little ball, he allowed that hurt to be a kind of chrysalis. And yet, sadly, Jack died, presumably blowing himself up in his garage while he was working on material for a special effects company. His wife, Marjorie Cameron, brilliant artist, she believed Jack was murdered. I think the greater likelihood is Jack simply blew himself up in his garage, but he died at a very young age. And it's a tragedy because I think he was a great intellect. And how he managed to attract everyone from Aleister Crowley to Marjorie Cameron to L. Ron Hubbard, all very intense but different kinds of people, is extraordinary. And we'll never fully understand Jack Parsons, but that's why I began with him, because he's just become such a fulcrum and a point of fascination. And he is for me too, not because he was a wild man, but because he was a thinker. He was always asking himself questions, even when he suffered downturns. And there was an ingenuousness about the man, which is why L. Ron Hubbard was able to take advantage of him for a time.
I mean, yeah, well, first of all, it does, that old adage, it's not rocket science, really sort of comes to mind with Jack Parsons. Like, it turns out rocket science is serious stuff because you could blow your
hard.
But I think that when you're talking about that tension between Crowley and Parsons, which again I think is one of the things that I found running through this whole book, and comes up again with Burroughs, William S. Burroughs,
yes,
the beat writer who is also in this book as well, and Burroughs' argument that you don't need ritual, that the sort of act of writing, the act of creation, is itself a kind of magic. And it seems like, again, a real sort of, when I come back to the title of your book, Modern Occultism, the tension that seems to run through it in a really fascinating way is this question of, is the occult something where there are forgotten tombs with tomes, maybe tomes in tombs, forgotten tombs with forgotten tomes, in which there will be spells and incantations that are written out, and recipes that if we follow to the letter, we will find the philosopher's stone, we will convert lead into gold, we will cure cancer, whatever the deal is. This idea that it is about ritual and tradition, and that you're trying to rediscover a lost, hidden, broken thing that you're trying to put back together. Or is occultism a kind of modern production and creation whereby one achieves this through, intention and a kind of creative sort of making up of the rituals themselves and that kind of thing? And that seems to be, the kind of difference between somebody like Crowley on the one hand versus, everyone from Levi to, Burroughs to Parsons, this idea that no, the goal is to just kind of make the thing. And I found that such a really fascinating, productive tension that really gets to this question of what is, modern occultism? What is the thing that you're talking about throughout this whole book?
That's beautifully framed. And Burroughs would have agreed with the latter part of your statement, that we are here to cut up, to make believe, to make up, to dramatize. And I think if there's a theme that runs through the lives of the greatest artists and voices who came out of the post-occult revival era, let's say Austin Osman Spare, Jack Parsons, William Burroughs, there was not only a wish for simplicity, but a wish to kind of tear up the rule book, not out of frustration, but out of creation. Burroughs believed, I was saying earlier how the Abrahamic parameters can be very limiting. Burroughs believed that our concepts of linearity and linear time were very limiting, that in fact linearity is conditioned, it's artificial, it's conceptual, it's not absolute. So he sought in all of his work, both magic and literature, to disrupt linearity. So Burroughs, for example, would say it would be a terrific magical operation if you, let's say you get an email and it's confusing to you, it's perplexing. What's the point of view? What's this person trying to get at? He would say, well, just take the damn thing and cut it up, print it out and cut it up with scissors, or do something else, rearrange it. It's like a tarot spread. You know, one person might say it's illegitimate, it's nonsense. Well, you find out, throw the damn pieces on the floor, pick them up, reassemble them. That was his form of magic. And his proof was pragmatism. Does it work? Are you satisfied? Are you happier today than you were yesterday? And that was Burroughs. And I like that. I like that. And it might be a matter of personal taste that drives me to like that. When I was a kid, I grew up in a fairly orthodox religious setting in the borough of Queens. And as I aged, I moved away from that. The liturgy, the thickness, the call and response prayer, the congregational setting. It wasn't for me. I wasn't responding to it anymore. And so when I find these figures who aren't responding to that kind of structure in occultism, I'm very sympathetic to what they're trying to accomplish. Some of them died young, like Jack. Some of them died elderly, like Burroughs. But I think there's something there. I find meaning there, personally.
We are getting close to the end, and so I'm going to encourage people once again, if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A or in the chat. At this point, I can probably field both, but we've got a couple questions from Josh, so I'm gonna bring those to your attention. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. So Josh, first he wants to ask, can you talk about the practice of Sufism and its similarities and differences to the Kabbalah tradition and Judaism?
Well, Sufism is sometimes thought of as the mystical wing of Islam. And I didn't group it within the rubric of modern occultism for the same reason that, let's say an esoteric Buddhism or esoteric Hinduism, is that these religions, these traditions, while they have esoteric qualities, they're very much a branch from an exoteric tree, from a traditional faith that's recognized, practiced, whereas occultism is a story of religion lost and found. Sufism is extraordinary because it expresses itself within traditional Islam in a wide variety of ways. Now, you could find, for example, in Iran, what might be considered, I don't like using these words because they really hem us into something, but might be considered a more conservative form of Sufism, where there is a feeling that the individual is able to reach, pierce the veil without intermediaries, for example, pierce the veil through ecstatic dance or through operations. But within Iranian Sufism, in its mainstream form, there's also a great deal of social conservatism. There have been branches of Sufism where they'll have bacchanals, they'll have sex, they'll drink wine, they'll do all the things that you're not supposed to do as a mainstream Muslim. There was a Sufi community actually in the burned over district that just closed because of financial problems during COVID, called the Abode of the Message, which was run by a man named Pir Vilayat. Pir is now deceased. But that attracted a lot of hippies, and the ecstatic dance, the music, the feeling that, yes, we're within a structure, but we have the freedom to exit that structure. It's exciting. It's exciting. And so you find that tradition within Islam, but I don't want to give the misimpression that everybody just gets along great. You have nations and societies and cultures where Sufis are horribly persecuted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Josh has a couple other questions. I'm gonna cycle through some other people's thoughts, and if we have time, we can come back to more of Josh's.
Sure.
Jeff wants to know, what was Mark Twain's connection with the esoteric?
Mark Twain's connection with the esoteric was that, as we were saying earlier, he was neither quite skeptic nor quite believer. There was a part of Mark Twain that was unwilling to slam shut the door on anything. So he had an interest in spiritualism. He had an interest in Mary Baker Eddy and the Christian Science tradition. I'm not suggesting that's a cult, but that grew out of the transcendentalist ferment of New England. And Twain was kind of one of these people who, he would probably say something to the effect of, Ghosts, of course I don't believe on them, except on Tuesdays when the attic starts creaking. He was a man who had his fingers in everything and didn't feel this need to declare himself a flag waver for one camp or another. So his curiosity was unbounding. He was very aware of spiritualist and mind thought or mind power currents in his era.
Yeah, and of course we're here at the Mark Twain House virtually, and so a little nod to him as well. This is not a question, but Darcy's chat comment I feel is worth boosting. So much drama in the occult world, and yes, I think that is one thing I've also come across over and over again, is that everybody's got drama.
Everybody's got drama. Everybody, I think part of what fuels drama is we as a human community, and this has been worsened by social media, we turn everything into a contest. Yeah. And there's this inability to just leave one another alone. And that atmosphere of contest really kills the search, I think.
Yeah. Grace wants to know, in the past few years, it seems that there has been a growing interest in things like tarot, crystals, witchcraft, and other esoteric practices. Why do you think that is? And do you see patterns throughout history of when these kinds of surges and resurgences of interest arise?
It's a great observation. And I swear to you, 10 years ago, if a journalist would ask me that question, I would say, no, the occult's an evergreen. I'm not really seeing that. Now I'm seeing it. And of course, one could cite technology. And technology places its thumbprint on everything. But we are living through, I'm thinking of the Chinese proverb. We are living through interesting times. And I'm not quite sure why, but for example, we were talking earlier about the Hermetic literature. That was neglected for a long time. It's really in our generation that we have the first really serviceable English translations of Hermetic literature. As I track it, it started in 1992. Cambridge University Press published a translation by a man named Brian Copenhaver, and it's brilliant. The first really, truly serviceable English translation, and others have followed. We're rediscovering Hellenic astrological texts that had never been translated. At the end of the Second World War, Gnostic texts were discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. The Nag Hammadi Library gave us a whole new window on Gnosticism, including alternate gospels and so forth. And of course, there's the whole UFO thesis that has gone so public today. So we are in the midst of a kind of petite renaissance of re-engagement with the esoteric. I mean, the significance of the findings of the Nag Hammadi literature, I think we haven't fully gotten our arms around yet. That's given us a new viewpoint into Gnosticism. And I've said this earlier, the first 20 minutes of the Barbie movie are a kind of Gnostic statement. I'm not suggesting the filmmakers necessarily felt that way, but we're drinking from this well water where all of us feel like this is kind of an ersatz world. There's something wrong here. There's something not quite adding up here in this world that we live in. And that was, in a manner of speaking, the Gnostic point of view. And we're re-engaging with this stuff in ways that I don't fully understand why it's all converging right now, but it's really there. It's really there. And my message to people is, look, take advantage of it. If you're curious about the Hermetic literature, you can read good translations, and people a generation ago didn't have that available to them. Use it.
I mean, yeah, I'm laughing, but I do think that the Barbie movie is a sort of like deeply existential text on its face. Like, it's a really, I only saw it once in the theater, and now I feel like I need to see it again with the sort of having processed the sort of visual whatever, and sort of now actually think through some of the ideas. Darcy wants to know, we've got maybe time for two more. Darcy wants to know, Mitch, is there anyone you have covered or researched in the past who you think we have to leave in the past now? Or on the flip side, is there anyone you think needs revisiting in regards to the occult and the esoteric?
That's such a wonderful question, Darcy. Thank you. In the latter part of the book, I spend a lot of time on figures that might be associated with the left-hand path. Anton LaVey, Michael Aquino, Topi, Temple of Psychic Youth, Process Church. I think that some of these figures really produce material that's richer than has been understood. And I know Michael Aquino was a very heterodox personality, and some people find him objectionable, but his literary output, I think, has been unheralded and should be checked out. I mean, to me, he was a voice like Burroughs, very different person, very different set of concerns, but really, really interesting. I would say the same of LeVay. I would say the same of Temple of Psychic Youth and one of its co-founders, Genesis Peorage, brilliant artist. And even the Process Church, woefully misunderstood, but visually, and I would say even theologically, was richer than has been understood. I think those figures should be looked at anew.
And our last question, which I think is a good one to end on also, is from Sarah, who wants to know, speaking of drama, what is your favorite occult gossip item?
Oh, wow, how fascinating. Here it is, hands down, hands fucking down. As many of you know who follow my work, I don't like gossip, I don't like trash talk, but this is a real good one. I read about this in the book. It's sometimes called the hidden hand theory. The idea being that Madame Blavatsky was sent to America by some secret occult lodge to instigate the phenomena of spiritualism, but it all got out of control and it all got messed up. And she became a kind of pawn, although a very powerful pawn, in a struggle between these different hidden brotherhoods who were fighting for their own interests. And I write about it in the book. And the reason that I smile when I say this is because it's the kind of thing you're like, oh man, that's just some old folk tale from the dark corners of the occult. Why does Mitch spend all this time on that? There are so many different figures of such diffuse background who independently wrote about this and captured threads of it. And it fits together in such a phenomenally frustrating, symmetrical way that, call it whatever you will, it is the esoteric of the esoteric. And I spend some time in the book picking it apart because it's so damn fascinating. And I have had the experience in writing about it and feeling like I'm going into this kind of vertigo, apropos of the backdrop behind me, because it just gets so wild. And yet it's wild, but it's wild with an intellectual edge. And the historians and the different figures and theorists who have written about it include some formidable intellects, and it's worth checking out.
Wow. Well, thanks. I think we are at time. I want to thank everybody again for coming out. I want to, again, make a plug. As I said, as I started this, I just want to reiterate, what I loved so much about this book was how just overwhelmingly generous it was towards this topic, towards its readers, towards readers who might define themselves as skeptics, towards readers who might define themselves as believers. It managed to diffuse that very binary in a way that I found so refreshing and fun. And it's chock full of weirdness. It's chock full of just fascinating, great stuff. And I hope you all have a chance to pick it up. Back to you, Omar.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Colin. Thanks for being our moderator this evening. And thank you so much, Mitch. This was an amazing conversation. I'm so ready to read this book. If you have not bought it, please buy the book. You can buy it through us, through our store. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Omar.
Thanks, Mitch.
Everyone.